Hi, I'm Stephen Vantassel. You're listening to Living the Wildlife, discussing all things related to vertebrate pest control as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. This is the disclaimer for Wildlife Control Consultant and Pest Geek podcast for Living the Wildlife podcast. Always follow national, state, provincial, and local laws when using pesticides and or other control methods to manage pests. Wildlife Control Consultant, LLC, Pest Geek Podcast, Living the Wildlife Podcast, Stephen M. Vantassel, or their or his affiliates are not responsible for followers' use of the information provided here. Hi everyone, Stephen Vantassel here, Wildlife Control Consultant, bringing another episode of Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Hey, glad to have you on board. I hope you've had a great week. If you're wondering what you've been clicking on here, well, this is the Living the Wildlife podcast, who discusses all things related to the technical aspects of doing wildlife damage management. So this is a podcast, I should say, for primarily professionals, but if you're a homeowner, property owner, and you want to listen in, you are certainly welcome as well. However, we do want to warn you, we do get a little geeky here because we are part of the Pest Geek podcast. So if you're looking for something a little bit more technical, this is the place for you. Well, I have had an incredible week or so. It's been I'm still in training season. As those of you know, I have a day job that's involved in training pest control professionals or people getting into the field of pest control. And so it's training because people like to train when they're not having to grow crops or take care of cattle as well, or before the season. Because here in Montana, we covet our summers in time when it's not cold, to be sure. So you want to do your training indoors in the wintertime before things get warmed up, so then you get out and make hay while the sun shines, as they like to say. Well, this week we are going to talk about rabies prophylaxis. So, as you all know, rabies is a serious virus. It is one of the oldest known zoonotic diseases to mankind, and so we have evidence of it going back, I think, to Aristotle, I believe, mentioned it. It's been mentioned by even Muslim physicians. So it has been a long-standing infection. I think it even goes as far back as the Sumerians, which I believe is somewhere in the vicinity of maybe 2000 BC. So we're looking at a very long-standing virus, and despite our technological progress in the United States and elsewhere, people still get infected with this disease and die. Although not so much in the U.S., of course, because we have treatments. But when you go to the rest of the world, the southern hemisphere, for example, it is a devastating disease, partly because of free-ranging dogs, but nevertheless, it is serious. Here in North America, the primary cause of human-caused rabies is bats, of course, and now there are a small number of people who get infected from laboratory situations, people working with the pure virus, for example, or people involved in sometimes organ transplants. Believe it or not, people have contracted rabies that way because the cadaver that they were getting the organs from was also infected. So those things are extraordinarily rare, but not zero, right? So it's not like they've never happened, because certainly they have. And so I've been doing some work in this area in the rabies, and I came across some information that may not have been well known within our industry. So I thought I would do a little podcast here on rabies prophylaxis. So let me pull up my PowerPoint here, and we'll get right to it. So just to kind of give you some information first before I get there, I wanted to be sure you understand that the majority of the information I'm going to be talking about here is from a publication published by the MMWR, right? So this is called the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. This is a a journal published by the CDC, I believe the Centers for Disease Control. And the title of this particular publication is Use of a Modified Pre-Exposure Prophylaxis Vaccination Schedule to Prevent Human Rabies. Recommendations of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, United States, 2022. So this has been done a couple of years ago, not that long ago, but a couple of years ago, nevertheless. And so what this committee is a committee of medical professionals who evaluated the information that we have about rabies and then decided as to whether or not the schedule at the time of pre-exposure vaccination shots could be modified to make it more likely for people to take the shots, one, but while still maintaining protection against contracting rabies. Now, I want to be clear what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about the post-exposure. In other words, a raccoon bit you and you get the rabies shots. No, these are shots that you get prior to an exposure to reduce the need for the number of shots after an exposure, right? So we'll talk a little bit more about that. This is what we would call a true vaccination in the sense that you're trying to protect yourself prior to an exposure rather than after an exposure, which would be more of a treatment, right? So nevertheless, that's what we want to be sure we're clear on that. This is for pre-exposure prophylaxis, which just means protection against rabies. Of course, and those of us involved in the wildlife control industry, these are one of the things we have to be concerned about. Those of you in the pest control world, you often have to be concerned about the risks of pesticides as one of your key medical risks is exposure, long-term exposure to these pesticides. Well, in the wildlife control world, we often have to be concerned about zoonotics, that is diseases that transmit from animals to humans. And so that is one of our big concerns as well. We have some concerns with pesticide exposure as well, just like you in the pest control world have to think about zoonotic exposure too. It's just that the balance is different within these two particular fields. All right, so this article, if you want to Google it, it is certainly available. The first author is Agam K. Rao. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's spelled R-A-O. Now, this was published in 2022, so let me kind of give you the year here as I scroll down to it. So it's May 6th, 2022, volume 71, number 18. And that is, again, published by the CDC. And let me give that title to you again, because, again, a lot of the information I'm relying on, not all of it, but a majority of it, is the use of a modified pre-exposure prophylaxis vaccination schedule to prevent human rabies. Recommendations of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, United States, 2022, and that is published in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which is a journal from the Centers for Disease Control. So it is quite an article. Certainly you can enjoy reading it. It gives you a lot of technical information, but it's pretty useful to be sure, but I wanted to make sure I acknowledged that. All right, well, enough of that. Let me get on with the slideshow here and get on with this information about pre-exposure vaccinations. Okay, so in terms of the pre-exposure vaccines that are available, it comes in two flavors, if I can use that kind of a term. One version is called Imovax, that would be its trade name there. Human diploid cell is how it was made. In other words, there's human material that it was developed from. RabAvert is the other brand name, not trade name, brand name. RabAvert, and that is created from the virus being cultured in purified chick embryo cell. So that is a significantly different. So one is from an animal source, one is from a human source. Now, you say, well, why the difference? Well, the fact of the matter is some people are allergic to eggs, right? And they're allergic to some chicken products or certain animal products. And so that's a reason why you would take the human diploid cell version. Now, my understanding in both of these cases is that these are dead viruses. So you're not going to contract rabies from taking these vaccines, right? So that's just not a thing. It's not going to happen for you. So we're going to talk about whether you, as a wildlife control professional, should have these pre-exposure vaccines, right? So there's risk with every type of medical treatment that you undergo. This would certainly count for that. And so you personally have to evaluate with your medical professional, with qualified people, to determine whether it is suitable for you. I want to be clear, I'm not a medical professional, I'm not your doctor, I'm not your lawyer. I'm simply trying to provide you with some information based on some journal work that you can consider in consultation with your medical professional, because rabies is a concern for those of us in the wildlife control field. In the level of your potential exposure is obviously going to vary depending on the type of business. You know, it's one thing to have someone who is handling bats as 90% of their business. It's another thing for someone who has no work with bats, right? So obviously those distinctions are going to be rather significant. Now, rabies occurs in other animals other than bats, to be sure. However, the risk, the majority of people in the United States who've contracted rabies from wild animals have contracted it from a bat source. So not the only source, but that's certainly one of the key sources. So this is how it's that balancing act. So it's difficult for us to tease some of that out. So I want to kind of give you some background information so that you can make an informed conversation with your medical professional. All right. So what is it? What is the rabies pre-exposure vaccine? Well, it's a series of shots to develop patient immunity against the rabies virus. That's it in a nutshell. Kind of simplistic. It is what it says it is. So again, there's two types of PrEP. That's sort of the acronym that's used there. P, capital P, small r, capital E, capital P, for those of you that are driving, right? So there's two types. We've already mentioned them. The human diploid cell vaccine, HDCV, or the purified chick embryo cell vaccine. So you do have, and that is PCEC. You have two choices if you want to go down this particular route and get the pre-exposure vaccine. So what are the benefits of getting this particular vaccine, right? Let's talk about the positive aspects. Well, straight away, it reduces the number of shots you are required to receive after an exposure to rabies. So what specifically does that mean? Well, instead of having to get the 4 shots plus the human rabies immune globulin shot, the HRIG shot, so that would be a total of at least 5. If you had the pre-exposure vaccine, you would only need to have 2 vaccine shots. And you would not have to have the human rabies immune globulin shot. You say, well, Stephen, what's the big deal? So I saved myself 3 shots. Well, you want to be a little careful with that. At minimum, you'll save 2 shots, actually 3 shots. However, for those of us that weigh more, they actually have to give us 2 HRIG. That's the human rabies immune globulin shot. You say, well, what is that all about? So if I was, let's say, bitten by a raccoon and I did not have rabies pre-exposure vaccine, I would get a rabies shot and an HRIG shot, but the HRIG shot, that's the human rabies immune globulin shot, is based on weight. In other words, they have to create a shot based on how large I am, and that's done by weight. So the more you weigh, the more you get. And you're like, so, all right, what's the big deal, Stephen? Well, that one is to be given in the site of the bite, so it could be a little painful, and it's thick. So my understanding is, I've never received this particular shot, my understanding is that it has a syrupy texture to it, so it really can be painful. Now, we want to be clear about these rabies shots. It's not like back in the 50s, you might have heard the stories of people getting shots in their abdomen and all this sort of stuff. Those days are gone, right? But the human rabies immune globulin shot can be a little painful. And it can also be a little painful on your wallet, because when you're getting the extra shots that are required for rabies treatment, you have to pay more money. You say, well, don't I have to pay money for the rabies pre-exposure vaccine? The answer is yes. So you have to balance some of that out, whether your risk of needing post-exposure shots is less than the cost of what you're going to get with the rabies vaccine. So it's an economic decision as well. But this is where talking with your medical provider, and you may even want to talk to your health insurance. I've heard from certain wildlife control operators that their workman's comp insurance covered the rabies pre-exposure vaccine because the workman's comp didn't want to have the risk of a greater exposure to liability down the road if you happen to get exposed to a rabid animal, for example. So these are some of those risk-reward discussions that you have to have with your medical provider and your family as well. So I want to be clear, there are risks with the vaccine. We'll talk about some of those shortly. But nevertheless, there's also risks with getting rabies, right? So we have no cure for rabies. We only have a way to prevent rabies. So people say, well, what's the post-exposure shots? Well, that's basically preventing the rabies from continuing in your body. So it's not really a cure in the traditional sense of the word, okay? But nevertheless, we have treatments that could prevent you from getting full-blown rabies, but nevertheless, there are risks rewards all the way around. So those are some of the benefits of the pre-exposure vaccine. Now, how did this new group of medical doctors that dealt with the vaccine, what changed with their decision? Well, that's where we're going to get to first. So prior to 2022, the pre-exposure prophylaxis shots were required as 3. You had to get 3. When I took my shots back in the day, I had to get 3 pre-exposure rabies shots. Just truth in advertising, I had the rabies pre-exposure shots when I was doing field work. Those have to take place on day 0, day 7, and then on the third shot, you have a choice, either day 21 or day 28. The new recommendations as of 2022 is down to 2 shots. Those would occur on day 0 and day 7. So with the new recommendations, you don't have to get 3 shots anymore. You only need to get 2. So that's obviously a savings both in your time and your money as well as your pain, right? So these shots are all given in the arm. So just to be clear, the deltoid muscle, okay? And the cost, and again, this information is a little dated, but it comes from the journal article. It's about $1,100 for these shots. Now, there may be additional costs for the medical personnel that are involved as well, but I think that number might be just related to the supplies themselves, but I could be wrong about that. So the numbers change, but it's not, we're not talking about a $5 shot here, right? So this is expensive. Manufacturers had to put a lot of energy into creating these, and so it's not cheap, right? So that's a decision that you have to make on a financial basis. But the big news, the big takeaway I want you to have here, and that is the pre-exposure rabies shots are now no longer 3 shots. They are now, the recommendation is now 2 shots, which is pretty big. Are there side effects with these shots? Well, the answer is yes. Yes, there can be side effects with these shots. So Just to be sure you understand, as a rule of thumb, there's anywhere from 16,000 to 39,000 people a year receive the pre-exposure rabies shots. I would assume that's around the world. Okay, so not a small amount of people, and these shots have been out for a while, so it's not something that's just been created in the last week or so, to be sure. Now, so what are some of the side effects? Well, we know that people who get the shot will get pain, itching, swelling, and redness at the site of where they are injected. And that typically could occur within 48 hours. Okay, that's normal. Most people are probably going to get that. Not everyone, but a lot of people are probably going to get that. There is a small subset of people, and according to one publication I looked at, it said 6 out of 100 people will get these reactions. And that's allergic reactions. That's an itching rash, fever, joint pain, swelling, nausea, vomiting, shortness of breath. Typically, these will occur within 21 days. I think the article said on average they would occur within 12 days. So there is, that's going to impact your business if you get these pre-exposure shots and you happen to be one of those 6 to get some of these more serious side effects or more significant side effects. The article was careful to state that there have been no deaths. No one died from getting these shots, at least when they published their particular notification there. So that was from a state health department's website. But you can certainly talk with your physician, have your physician get more up-to-date information that won't be very hard for him or her to do, and determine whether or not there's a risk. Now, there are, of course, if you are a person who is allergic to chickens or eggs, then you would want to take the human diploid cell vaccine. So to avoid some of those negative side effects that you may get from the chicken cell version. So again, another thing to discuss with your medical provider. Now, what do you do if you are immunocompromised? Now, I'm using that as a broad umbrella term for people that say you have cancer and you're on immunosuppressive drugs. Maybe you have been a person who has received an organ, for example, and you have immunosuppressive drugs on board to prevent you from rejecting your organ donation, or perhaps you have a medical condition that suppresses your immune system. There are ways to still get treatment, but you need to discuss those options with your physician. One of them is to get that third prophylactic vaccine shot prior to your exposure to rabies. So rather than having only 2, you'd go back to the traditional 3. But again, a conversation that you would need to have with your physician if you're in a situation where your immune system is not considered quote-unquote normal. Okay, but again, have those conversations. So who needs to get the vaccine, right? So it's all based on relative risk. And so this is a risk scenario categorization system developed by this committee that reevaluated pre-exposure rabies vaccinations. And they came up with 5 levels of risk. Number 1 is the most serious level of risk. Number 5 is the lowest level of risk for contracting rabies. Because obviously, if your risk is essentially almost 0, well, you don't really need a rabies prophylaxis shot, right? That's just silly. Why would you if the likelihood of you contracting, being exposed to rabies is almost 0, then there's really no need for you to have a pre-exposure vaccine. It's just not needed. But if you're in the level 1, you probably do need to have a pre-exposure shot because the risk reward is going to be definitively in the favor of the vaccine. again, a conversation with your medical professional. So how do they classify these levels? So level 1 risk are people who have a high potential for unrecognized exposures to the virus. Now, let's be clear what we mean by unrecognized. Unrecognized means that you were exposed to the virus, but you did not know you were exposed. So that's different from having, you're working with a raccoon, the raccoon comes over and bites you. That is a recognized exposure. You knew you were bit. You know that the raccoon could have rabies. It's a mammal. It's a warm-blooded animal. It nurses young. Raccoons have rabies in certain parts of the country. They're a very common strain. Where I was in the Northeast, raccoon rabies was pretty serious in the mid-90s. Okay. So that would be a known exposure. But risk level 1 are people with a high potential for unrecognized exposures. And they give an example, like people in a laboratory working with live rabies virus, right? Because you can have a situation where the virus is actually aerosolized and you get exposed that way. So for those individuals, they recommend getting vaccinated on day 0, day 7, and then having your titers checked every 6 months. And if your titers show less than 0.5 international units per milliliter, then you should get a booster. Okay, that's level 1. I don't know of any wildlife control operators that would be in level 1. If you were, you probably wouldn't be a wildlife control operator, right? You'd be working in a lab somewhere. Now, level 2 are individuals who have a high potential for unrecognized exposure to the virus. However, these individuals are frequently handling bats, or they're doing animal necropsies, and they're doing preparations for rabies testing, for example. So that's a pretty high level. So if you're a wildlife control operator and maybe you're doing over 50%, I'm just throwing a number out here. Obviously, the researchers didn't talk about wildlife control operators in depth here, but that is our audience. If you work with bats a lot and you're doing a lot of handling of bats, maybe you're capturing them by hand and checking to see what species they are or something, or perhaps you deal with a lot of bats inside of houses that you have to sort of grab and this sort of thing, you have to, again, evaluate that risk. They suggest you're level 2 and that you should also get your rabies pre-exposure vaccination, get a shot on day 0, get a shot on day 7, and have your titers checked every 2 years. And again, the standard for your titers is 0.5 international units per milliliter. And so that is the standard for being, quote unquote, immune to rabies. Now, what's interesting about them picking that particular number is that their research found is that no one was really getting infections from rabies when they had a titer of 0.3. But they had so many requests from the public to establish a number that they said, okay, if we think people are actually immune at 0.3, we're going to make it 0.5 so that you have that little margin of safety. Because obviously, how do we test this, right? We're not going to take a bunch of humans, expose them to rabies. It's just not ethical, right? So they have to make sort of a judgment call here, and this is the judgment call they made. There's an interesting paragraph in the article if you want to read it, and it kind of discusses how they came up with this particular number. Now, level 3 is a high potential for recognized exposures. Again, this is where someone knows they've been exposed. Now, interestingly, this is individuals who are veterinarians, animal control officers, and they even mention trappers directly, which is kind of cool. So what was their recommendation here? Well, again, the vaccination, day 0, day 7, and a one-time titer check within 1 to 3 years after your second dose in the primary series. If you're below the 0.5 international units per milliliter, get a booster. Or the other option is you boost again no sooner than day 21 after your initial shot, pre-exposure vaccination, and no later than year 3 years after your second dose of the primary series. Primary series, of course, is the shot you got on day 0 and the shot you got on day 7. So it seems to me that the vast majority of wildlife control operators that are in, rabies areas, those of you, in the Northeast, for example, with the raccoon rabies, perhaps those of you dealing with a lot of skunk rabies or dealing with bats, and you have, a high level of rabies in your area. I mean, that's all relative. We don't have a lot of rabies in the United States, but a high level depending on what species you're handling, then you're probably going to be in a level 3 risk. Some of you, however, are going to be in the level 4 risk, and so there's a high potential for recognized exposures, but your time limited. So if you're someone who thinks you're only going to be working, maybe you're near the ending of your career, you've never gotten your rabies pre-exposure shots, but you're like, I'm probably going to be retiring in several years. Or you have workers that are only going to be working with you for a few years. That would be a level 4 because it's time limited. They're going to move on to a different career. In that situation, you're only going to get the regular vaccination on day 0 and day 7. And then, of course, people at the bottom, low risk of exposure, which they call the typical U.S. resident, and they don't recommend any vaccination at all, which perfectly makes sense, right? If your spouse, for example, is just someone who is handling the phone and handling the paperwork and not going out in the field with you to capture a bat in the middle of the night, why would he or she need to get a vaccination for rabies, right? It just doesn't make any sense because his or her risk is just as high as the businessman down the street, right? So again, this is how you want to be sure you have this conversation with your medical professional. All right, so we're getting up to our last slide here. So let me give you some suggestions on where to go from here. So I'm going to recommend, of course, as I've been stating over and over and over again in this podcast, consider your risk for rabies in consultation with your medical provider. Now, be honest. Look over your data. How much work are you doing? How significant is rabies within your state? What species of animals are you working with? And do they intersect with that rabies vector? Understand that these newer recommendations, again, they were published in 2022, so only a couple years old, they reduce the cost to you and your insurance provider. So it reduces your need to go from having 3 shots, now you only need to get 2 shots, which is huge unless you're an immunocompromised, and then that obviously changes things. You also have to balance what the cost of post-exposure is. So you may say, well, there's risk to getting the vaccine. There is. There's also the cost and the financial cost for getting that. But there's also the potential cost of the post-exposure shots, because you're going to get more shots, obviously going to be more expensive. You also have the human rabies immune globulin shot, which can be pricey in and of itself. And so ultimately, you have to evaluate your risk as a business owner, and you have to reevaluate your risk as your business changes. So let's say you don't think you need a pre-exposure rabies shots now, which is fine. Again, talk with your medical provider. But things may change if your business changes in maybe the next year, the next 2 years, where you may think you do need to have your rabies pre-exposure shots. So a lot of things to think about. Not certainly the most fun thing, certainly not going to make you feel warm because it's costing you money. It's about your health and this sort of thing. But it certainly is an important thing to talk about, and it's a part of your safety. And if you have employees, you need to be having this conversation with your insurance agent and your employees as well. because rabies is a very serious disease. Thankfully, we have treatments for it, but we can maybe protect ourselves a little bit more if we get the rabies pre-exposure shot, if it's suitable for you and your situation. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I'm Stephen Vantassel. You've been listening to Living the Wildlife as part of the Pest Geek podcast family. Would love it if you took a few moments, if you would, to ring the bell, subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this, and give us a 5-star review. Would be most grateful. You can also reach out to me at wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com, wildlifecontrolconsultant@gmail.com. Would love to hear your comments and thoughts about future shows. If you are interested in being on the show, definitely reach out to me. I'd love to hear what you have to offer to the industry, because I do think we don't get information out to the public sufficiently in our niche industry. So would love to hear from you. Again, if you have criticisms, comments, thoughts about the show, do reach out. I do like hearing from you, because it helps me make sure that I'm going to be servicing some of your needs. Again, Living the Wildlife, we deal with the technical aspects of wildlife damage management. So we're here for the thoughtful professional. So you've been listening to Living the Wildlife. Why do we call it Living the Wildlife? Well, because we want you to live the wildlife, not be the wildlife. Take care, everybody.